Hello and welcome to Race Before Race. Today we are really quite excited to have a wonderful panel for you um, on the subject of white supremacy and reception. But a few housekeeping matters first. I'm Cord Whitaker of Wellesley College. Today I will be your moderator, and I'm a member of the executive board of Race Before Race. Over these past few years, it has been one of our supreme joys to see how this symposia has inspired conversation, has inspired an increased ownership of pre-modernity by persons who are Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, and the impact that Race Before Race has had on our fields on the whole. So thank you for being here with us today. I'd like to begin by offering a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you today from my hometown of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I'm also representing Wellesley, Massachusetts, where Wellesley College is. So I want to acknowledge that the land on which I sit right now encompasses the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. We take this opportunity to honor the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that have facilitated the city of Philadelphia's, my hometown's, presence here today. I also want to recognize that the college where I work and teach, and which has helped support this meeting of Race Before Race generously through its Moffett Fund, is located on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded lands of the Massachusetts tribe. The college is on stolen land, and we extend our gratitude to the many indigenous peoples who have rich histories there, including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc nations, for their ongoing stewardship of the land. I wish to affirm indigenous sovereignty and commit to holding Wellesley College and the other institutions represented here today more accountable to the needs of indigenous peoples. We certainly have to thank Brandeis University for its support of this meeting of Race Before Race. And of course, we must thank our Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies and Arizona State University for their generous support of Race Before Race over the years, and the leadership of ACMRS's director, Ayanna Thompson, and as well as the extraordinary support we receive from the staff at ACMRS, including Leah Newsom and Jeff Way. I have a really exciting announcement that I want to make about about the successes of one of our Race Before Race board members and one of yesterday's presenters, Scott Manning Stevens, who, it was just announced today, will be a Harvard Radcliffe Institute Fellow for 2021 through 2022. So, having already heard the wonderful work we heard from him yesterday, we can be nothing but overjoyed and excited about what the next year of dedicated research time at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute will produce. So, congratulations. So many congratulations there. All right. So, with that, let me say a few words about how we'll proceed today. Bear with me just a moment. We will have each speaker speak in succession. Um, Our speakers are extraordinarily accomplished. Simply for the sake of time, I cannot go into all of their accomplishments, but you can read their impressive biographies in the program. So once I turn it over to them, we will hear directly from them. If Let's see, when you have questions, you should be using the Q&A button, which appears at the bottom of your screen, and you can type your questions in there. And when we get to time for the Q&A, I will voice your questions to our presenters, and they will take them as is appropriate. Also, if you need closed captioning, that is available. If you look at the lower part of your screen to the right, you will see a closed captioning live transcript button. And as soon as you hit that, you will have access to a closed captioned transcript of our meeting. So I will just briefly offer the order in which we'll hear our speakers and their titles. So first we'll hear from Roland Betancourt with The Far Right's Whitewashed Byzantium. Then we'll hear from Joyce Green MacDonald with Finding Black Women in Shakespeare. And then from Patrice Rankine with Pre-Racial Fantasies, Locating Antiquity and the American Stage at the Fin de Siècle. With that, I think that's all the housekeeping we need to do. Oh yes, we do encourage live tweeting. So if you are live tweeting, and we hope you are, please do be sure to use the hashtag RaceB4Race. Right. With that, we will have Roland take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me get my PowerPoint up. Great. Thank you so much for having me here today. This is truly a pleasure. And I want to begin, of course, by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from Irvine, California, which is the ancestral home of the Tongva and Ahashiman people. And I also want to, of course, acknowledge the fact that the LA Basin and its areas are, of course, home to many indigenous people today from across Latin America and the Pacific Islands. And I want to take the time today to share an ongoing research with you that I feel is as critical to the work I do within medieval studies and particularly Byzantine studies as the work that I also do on the modern world and the state of my field. And I'm speaking to you in particular as a Byzantinist, someone who works in the Byzantine Empire. So with that in mind, I'd like to begin. Thank you again to all the organizers. Over the past year, the conversion of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul back into a mosque has been smoldering in the background of global politics. Built as the Church of Holy Wisdom by the architects Anthemius and Isidorus under Emperor Justinian between 532 and 537 CE, the monument has had a long and complex history. It served as the key imperial church of the Byzantine Empire until its conquest by the Ottomans in 1453, when it was converted into a mosque under the Ottoman Empire, and eventually it was turned into a museum in 1934 in the early days of the Turkish Republic. As an emblem of the Byzantine Empire and associated with various modern-day orthodoxies, however, the role of Hagia Sophia in modern discourse has long been used as a subterfuge for promoting anti-Islamic rhetoric under the guise of cultural heritage and preservation. From Charlottesville to the Capitol, medieval imagery has been repeatedly on show at far-right rallies and riots in recent years. Displays of crusader shields and tattoos derived from Norse and Celtic symbols are of little surprise to medieval historians like me, who have long documented the appropriation of the Middle Ages today by the far right. But amid all the expected Viking imagery and nods to the Crusaders, there has been another dormant medievalism that has yet to be fully acknowledged in reporting on both the far right and conspiracy theory movements, namely the Byzantine Empire. In September 2017, Jason Kessler, the white nationalist organizer of the infamous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, inaugurated a new white supremacist group entitled, quote, the New Byzantium. Kessler's manifesto describes this body as a premier organization for pro-white advocacy in the 21st century. The premise being that when Rome fell, the Byzantine Empire went on to preserve a white European civilization. For Kessler, this new Byzantium is intended to preserve white dominance after, quote, the inevitable collapse of the American empire, end quote, going on to tout itself as a civil rights organization and a nonprofit dedicated to preserving Western civilization. The same narrative today is scattered across QAnon boards who spout conspiracy theories about a deep state cabal of Satan-worshiping, blood-drinking pedophiles running the world. And these declarations, dispersed across 4chan, its subsequent iterations, Twitter, Instagram, and other social media platforms, including Facebook, discuss the Byzantine Empire as either continuing the legacy of Rome after it was allegedly destroyed by the Jews, or Byzantium being the only true empire, Rome having been a mythical invention to degrade its power. In some renditions, Byzantium is the original foundation of the deep state, which has persisted in secrecy since its fall, and trades in eunuchs or preserves whiteness and Christianity, depending on the leanings of the thread. Most Americans, however, have never heard of Byzantium. In the United States, Byzantium is rarely taught, and when it is subsumed under a narrative of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and set alongside the outdated narratives of the, quote, Dark Ages still being taught in many of our high schools. At most, one might have learned in passing about the mosaics of Emperor Justinian and Theodore in Ravenna, most likely as a colorful side illustration in the textbook illustrating the early Middle Ages. And yet Byzantium has had a significant place in the imaginary of the so-called alt-right and other adjoining white nationalist groups across an ever more nefarious internet. The entanglements seen between Byzantium and white nationalist mouthpieces are not as cursory, random, or haphazard selection of just an organization's name. For years, Byzantium has appeared throughout far-right social media, primarily in the Russian, Serbian, and Greek spheres and their diasporas, connected to radicalized iterations of orthodoxy. On Instagram alone, we can find countless memes that deploy kitschy crusader images alongside well-known far-right tropes. In one example, we see the image of Pepe the Frog in his racist 4chan manifestation as Kek depicted as a kneeling crusader holding a bloody sword before a scene of destruction in a desert landscape. The scene is captioned on the image, Kek wills it, echoing the alt-right's preferred crusader cry, God wills it, Deus vult, which with Kek replacing that God. Curiously, the hashtags tell us little about medieval history per se. Instead, they speak repeatedly of Rome, accompanied by hashtags like retake Constantinople or simply hashtag Byzantines. More explicit posts speak to a vision of Byzantine supremacy or the insistence that Hagia Sophia and Constantinople will be reconquered. In one such example, posted in late 2015, we see a Western depiction of Christ floating in the foreground above Hagia Sophia, while the military figure of St. George slaying the dragon stands behind him as what we understand to be a metaphor for the defeat of the Turkish state here. This point is made explicitly clear when we look closer into the image, which is tightly cropped so as to erase the Ottoman minarets from the building, and the spire at the top of the dome has been replaced with a resplendent gold cross. The hashtags go on to reassert that narrative of defeat and reconquest. This narrative of the reconquest of Constantinople is the most prominent appearance of Byzantium within Orthodox groups that wish to see a Christian Constantinople once again. But these narratives are as old as May 29th, 1453, when the city was overwhelmed by Ottoman forces. Following the conquest of Constantinople, laments for the city were written throughout the early modern period. While relatively understudied, these Greek laments, or threnoi, speak to two key notions evident in these social media posts. Firstly, the divine will of God in these military quests, and secondly, that the city will be Christian again. In one dialogue between the personifications of Venice and Constantinople, the figure of Constantinople says that it is, quote, by divine will that I fell from the throne, end quote. And in another lament for Hagia Sophia itself, angels descend from heaven as the masses are huddled celebrating the liturgy during the siege. The angels admonish the priest to cease the liturgy, saying, quote, stop the Cherubicon and lower the sacred objects. Priests, take the chalices, and you all turn off the candles, because it is the will of God that the city be Turkish, end quote. The laments and historical chronicles attest to this idea that Constantinople did not so much fall as it was put in a state of suspended animation. The texts speak about the relics and icons departing the city and ascending into heaven so that they may be safeguarded until the return of Christian rule. Even the Emperor Constantine Palaiologos was understood not to have died, but rather to have been petrified at the time of the fall and entombed in the city's walls, awaiting the return of the empire. Today, excerpts of these laments for the city are being quoted on QAnon message boards to lament the conversion of Hagia Sophia and to speak of the prophesized reconquest of the city and the monument. These stories, diluted across the centuries, are vividly at work in contemporary online culture. Posts touting the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a church as an impending reality or threat are prevalent. For example, you often find tightly cropped images of Hagia Sophia with a modern Orthodox cross photoshopped onto its dome. The ominous meme-like script over reading soon, ... with hashtags like Constantinople will rise, hashtag retake Constantinople. In one poignantly casual iteration of this meme, we see a person holding an Orthodox cross necklace over the dome of Hagia Sophia, superimposing it in real time in Istanbul in a gesture that is striking in its banality as it is in its violence. The caption here again reads, one day, ... Such violence of erasure is perhaps best embodied in this image, shared by a Slavic nationalist, which shows an exalted Orthodox cross on a step pedestal before a resplendent sun. Its appearance cuts through the shadow of clouds over Istanbul while blood-red rays shatter the minarets of Hagia Sophia. The gold spire atop the dome that is being destroyed in this image is not like the one atop the building today, but has been replaced with a crescent moon to emphasize the destruction of Islam. Posted in late 2017, the image shows Hagia Sophia as a mosque in order to re-articulate the object of destruction, namely Islam and the Turkish state. The caption makes the point of this image explicitly clear, saying, quote, one day we will reclaim our stolen city, Constantinople, end quote. In March 2019, a terrorist attack in Christchurch, New Zealand claimed the lives of over 50 worshippers at two mosques. In his 74-page manifesto posted on the infamous 8chan message board, the shooter railed against the Turks and the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, stating, quote, we are coming for Constantinople, and we will destroy every mosque and minaret in the city. The Hagia Sophia will be free of minarets, and Constantinople will be rightfully Christian-owned once more, end quote. Such historical citations are prolific across infamous message boards where the so-called alt-right and QAnon conspiracies theories have been thriving for the past years. Yet the Byzantine Empire, its former capital, and Hagia Sophia have been a consistent presence in the vocabulary of white supremacy and Islamophobia, gaining immense popularity in the fall of 2017, curiously alongside the rise of QAnon itself. Over the past year, as the news of Hagia Sophia's conversion into a mosque trickled through news outlets, such posts have naturally escalated in number and intensity. Yet already in the build-up to the 2016 election and its aftermath, the narratives of Constantinopolitan reconquest have been explicitly politicized in the guise of US politics. Memes like Emperor Justinian wearing a hat that says, make the Roman Empire great again, quickly gives way to the more sinister reality of what seems like a nerdy joke. There are multitudes of hats and shirts online that clearly explore this connection between Byzantium and America, such as a rendition of the MAGA hats that reads, make Istanbul Constantinople again, or shirts that say Constantinople Reclamation Squad or 1453, worst year ever, or the Coca-Cola logo reworked as retake Constantinople. And many posts across social media seek to rebuke those who might call it Istanbul instead of Constantinople. Associations between Byzantium and extremism in America are well attested. The hashtag Orthodoxy or Death, for example, documents associations between Christianity, Orthodoxy, and Confederates, and these ties are seen in other hashtags as well. Today, it is common to see Make Istanbul Constantinople Again circulated with QAnon-associated hashtags, and the call for its reclamation is found across QAnon boards. Even a simple Twitter search of the keyword Constantinople sheds light on the violent ideologies brewing under the guise of Byzantium today. The reconquest of Constantinople was explicitly tied in these circles to Donald Trump's presidency, with images that prophesized this event during his rule. In the most popular of these, Trump is depicted congratulating Putin on the retaking of Constantinople, shaking hands before the Blue Mosque, which surely the person composing this image thought was Hagia Sophia. Yet other such images of this ilk play with the union of Trump and Putin as one where Putin admonishes Trump for calling the city Istanbul, or where Trump himself asks for the city's conquest on behalf of Russia. These memes have even led to their own prophetic logic as online readers analyze the formal connections between existing press images and those that have been photoshopped into existence, as we see here. Certainly, it is possible to historically contextualize the promulgation of such memes throughout the Slavic and Greek worlds, and certainly one can reasonably understand their appearance with pockets of orthodoxy in the United States. Yet one is left to wonder why American teenagers with no ties to orthodoxy in any capacity would be championing the reconquest of Constantinople alongside the Crusader cry of Deus Vult, and the OK hand gesture popularly understood in this period to be a dog whistle for white power. For example, following the news coverage of the OK gestures white power associations, one Reddit post took the American Sign Language alphabet and produced a satirical alphabet of alt-right language with a suggestion that it be shared with Vice in order to confuse the liberal media. This is a deeply disturbing and grotesque series of alleged hand gestures, which is why I have opted not to show it here today, advocating everything from rape to lynching, and yet it culminates with the words Byzantium, open parentheses, retake Constantinople, close parentheses. While to the uninformed reader, this might come off as the nonsensical punchline to a sick joke, what we can appreciate from this evidence is that Byzantium has found a strange place within a newfound vocabulary of hatred and genocide. Nevertheless, this does not answer the earlier question of how or why Byzantium has found such a home in the far right's online culture. The view of Byzantium here is one that is fundamentally contradictory to the Byzantium taught in American history books, which has traditionally had a fairly negative view of the empire. It is a view of world history where the Crusaders did not pillage, destroy, and occupy the city of Constantinople in the 13th century. It is a view where Italians did not mock the Byzantine emperors for their dark skin. It is a view where Venice did not ignore the calls for aid from Constantinople in 1453. And it does not acknowledge the fact that the Byzantines were seen as much as infidels in Western eyes as their Islamic neighbors, excommunicated by the Pope in the mid-11th century, for their heretical ideas regarding everything from the use of leavening in the Eucharistic bread to the progression of the Holy Spirit. In these memes, we see no trace of the, quote, servile and effeminate Greeks of Byzantium, end quote, that Edward Gibbon decried in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire from 1776, and which has long marginalized the Byzantine Empire in the English-speaking world. In our dictionaries, of course, the adjective Byzantine covers a range of insulting characteristics encompassing everything that is overly complicated, bureaucratic, devious, and corrupt. Nowhere in popular Western history is there a vision of Byzantium that fits what we saw online in the ramp up to the 2016 presidential election and in response to the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque by the Turkish state in 2020. What we are seeing espoused in these various online posts is a vision of Byzantium from a Greek, Serbian, and Russian nationalist perspective, but one that has somehow managed to permeate the online culture of the far right. The answers as to how and why this has occurred merits and deserves concerted research and careful scrutiny. But as newfound laments for Hagia Sophia are sung, it is necessary to be aware of these unholy entanglements and to remember conditions under which Hagia Sophia was built in the 6th century. After the original Hagia Sophia was burned down in an uprising against Emperor Justinian, he is said to have slaughtered over 30,000 of his own citizens, defiantly building the new church from the ashes. Throughout the centuries, it served as the imperial stage for the coronation of emperors, the marriage of dynasties, and the performance of the usual and habitual ceremonies of state. Hagia Sophia has always been political, emerging from the utterly brutal state politics of Justinian and serving as the contested space of imperial power and dominance. It is impossible to condone the Trumpian politics motivating Erdogan's use of Hagia Sophia, yet the contestation of power and faith through this building is poignantly in keeping with its long imperial histories. As scholars lament the desecularization of Hagia Sophia, we must remember the sinister role that Byzantium plays in white supremacist rhetoric and how these laments feed into these Islamophobic narratives. It is wholly intolerable to overlook the deep entanglements that the conversion of Hagia Sophia has had with ideations of a white ethno-state, genocide, and Islamophobia, something that the field of Byzantine studies has yet to acknowledge or reckon with. Before speaking to you today, I wondered if I wanted to present on this difficult material. A large part of me did not want to give voice to such vile hatred in such a wonderfully affirming space, where we come together to carefully share our work on race in the Middle Ages. I am worn down by narratives that re-victimize or that callously display the ways in which the Middle Ages, in all iterations, are being deployed today by various white supremacist groups. Yet I am also conscious that the focus of this conference is politics, and that this orientation demands me to think of how our work contributes to these discussions in our public spheres. In October 2020, I published my book, Byzantine Intersectionality, Sexuality, Gender, and Race in the Middle Ages, where I looked at matters of sexual consent, reproductive rights, trans identity, queerness, and racialization, particularly seeking to understand how these categories intersect in medieval race thinking. Over the months that followed, I have spent much of my time working to produce op-eds that reflect the key themes addressed in my book, with the aims of expanding and broadening this public discourse. Of course, I have gotten vitriolic hate emails shortly after each one comes out, and contrary to what it might seem to many of my white colleagues, this project was not a product of the previous presidency, but directly emerged before that from the various discarded and ignored subjectivities I had perceived in the margins of my research across Byzantine studies. As a queer Latinx person, I long confronted a disjuncture with how my peers were approaching the historical record and their explicit complicities in our field with far-right nationalist groups tied to the Byzantine legacy, and of course, the promotion of transphobic and homophobic programs. One person loosely in my field has even called for the extermination of all LGBT people. And several of the Byzantine accounts that were on my hate speech watch list in 2017 have concertedly attacked my book and this research since it came out. Our research and these politics are not separate entities. All of us here are intimately aware of this. There is no difference between our medieval work and that on the politics that dominated in the present. In thinking about medieval race, we find ourselves bound to its politics today. And I hope that with this paper, you are better equipped to notice forms of Byzantinizing white supremacy and Islamophobia, both in order to call it out, but also to protect yourself from it. To me, this research on the far right's interest in Byzantium is not some curious study into popular culture or historiography, but it is about protecting myself and you, my fellow colleagues, as we work toward a more equitable past and future. Thank you very much.
There we go. Thank you very much too, Roland. The title of my papers remain the same. Although on Tuesday, I thought I knew what I was going to say today entirely, but then I heard Professor Haley's impassioned and inspirational opening talk about Blackness and classicism, and I was moved to throw out most of what I'd already written and start over. If any of my students are hearing me today, please don't do that. Those who know my work know that I've always been interested in how early modern texts and genres process the classical past, so as to make themselves known in the present through the honored resources of the ancient world, and to borrow some of that gravity and dignity for themselves. Ben Jonson assures us that at its best, this practice of poetic imitation in the hands of the right modern poet will let him connect himself to some favored ancient author, and so follow him till he grow very he, or so like him as their copy may be mistaken for the principal. Writers who prove themselves capable of the exactness of study that Jonson said was necessary to grasp the essence of a previous poem or poet would then be free to demonstrate that they could reproduce the matter and style of their ancient cultural, of these ancient cultural artifacts with elegancy in their own works, and thus close the gaps of time and distance and memory between ourselves and what we want to identify as our intellectual and cultural origins. It didn't occur to me until much later how vast some of those temporal and spatial gaps can be, and how difficult it can be to traverse such uncharted spaces. Neither did I understand how much depends on that word we, on who your companions were as you followed authors and texts and modes back into the past, and on what the politics and social practices of reading were that bound you together on your journey. I grew up in a family of poor Black strivers in Louisville, the youngest daughter of 2 migrants from Selma, Alabama, who barely finished the 6th grade. The soundtrack of our house was jazz and Beethoven and soul music, and our parents encouraged us to read anything we wanted to read. One of my earliest memories is pulling our house's only bookcase over on top of myself, and when I was trying to reach my older sister's copy of the high school anthology that included Macbeth. I started writing about race and Renaissance drama very early in my academic career, partly spurred on by the vibrancy of Black American popular culture in the 90s when I was professionally starting out, as well as by the decade-stirring roll call of Black female firsts. Mae Jemison flying into space, Toni Morrison winning the Nobel Prize, Serena Williams' first Grand Slam, Carol Moseley Brown's election to the US Senate, Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust. I didn't see anything inconsonant about thinking of all my pasts. I am my parents' daughter. I am a Black Southerner. I'm an amateur Shakespearean. I'm also a trained Shakespearean. I didn't see anything odd about thinking of all my pasts working together, mutually aiding each other and me, as we follow Johnson's journey back towards Shakespeare and what lay even farther backwards beyond him. Starting out, I expected that the nimbleness and associative pleasure that marked my own beginnings as a Shakespearean would carry over into my new professional communities. I was largely wrong about that. My Shakespearean we wasn't the same as the we that dominated the field at that time. And my journey to the past was not the same journey that Johnson assures us will arrive at its intended destination if we only work with enough exactness of study and apply the right aesthetic measure of elegancy to conceal our hard work. I had no doubt that I would find Black women in the early modern classical framing that interested me. But as I began my project, I soon encountered a problem I couldn't quite name at first. Using familiar tropes and allusions to foundational texts and historical moments was supposed to be a means of proclaiming culture's continuity, as though the global events unfolding in Shakespeare's lifetime, the first English transatlantic slaving voyage in 1564, the foundation of a permanent colony in the New World in 1607, as though these events had all happened before, but they hadn't. Classically minded writers in this colonial world had to figure out how to negotiate passage from the past to the present in ways that far exceeded figuring out which ancient writer they wanted to imitate. They would have to learn how to represent new geographies, new economic practices, and especially for my interests, new relations between races within the frame of their chosen author or classical style. Anything but orderly and linear, as Johnson's good student model of reading has it. Evolution from past to present didn't just bring texts and genres and forms into the present, but also the ideologies those forms have been used to mediate, the histories they have been called on to organize. I finally began to realize that the problem of finding Black women in the imitative literary practices of this early colonial world was what they themselves, their stories, their voices had been lost in the void of the Middle Passage. The vastness of Atlantic space, as well as the passage into a new kind of race-based global economic order, formed a kind of dead zone that no poetic practice, or even the most joyful and exploratory reader's practice, could easily cross, much less renew in the present. What we see happening in the example of 17th century colonial classicism I'm going to talk about here, small example, is a moment of crisis for imitative practice, especially when it came to accounting for the presence of Black women and of interracial sex in the colonial world. We know, for example, that almost incomprehensible acts of physical violence, psychological abuse, starvation, and especially for female slaves, rape, defined the process of enslavement that began during the passage westward across the Atlantic. Denigrated to the status of mere flesh, as in Horton Spiller's usage, the bodies of female slaves became a grounds for demonstrating their complex absence from a subject position through the very tortures to which they were subjected. Reading and disseminating the records of the tortures that slave women suffered can paradoxically result in obscuring their lives even further, rendering them historically visible as only the objects to which their enslavement reduced them. The archive of their suffering uses its power to morally anonymize its records of how people were turned into things. Historians like Jennifer Morgan and Marisa Fuentes and Jessica Marie Johnson are showing us how to read these muted archives of slavery oppositionally, against and outside the interests of those who assembled and normalized and preserved the records of this dehumanization. But I'd like instead to suggest that the early modernists, or at least those of us who have a classical bent to their interests, may well be equipped to continue this work. Because so much New World plantation discourse is classical in its orientation and its framing, comes to us through the classical resources that poets like Johnson idealized. Saidiya Hartman has noted how often stories of the violation of sexual taboos that constituted such an essential part of the display of masters' absolute power over the people they enslaved were littered with what she calls the brutal Latin phrases that their educated British authors reflexively turned to. It is in slave culture's Latinisms that we can see how wayward and inconsonant the classical past's influence on the present can be. Thomas Thistlewood, who was once the overseer of a Jamaican plantation called Egypt, used Latin in his diary's accounts of his rapes of female slaves. Cum flora a Congo, super terram, that is to say, on the ground, among the canes above the wallhead, he wrote. About 2 a.m., cum with Negro girl, super floor at North Bedford. On July 2nd, 1770, he whipped a young Congo girl named Sally for stealing food. And the next day he raped her, super terram, on the ground. While Thistlewood's Latin has devolved to the level of a convenient record-keeping shorthand, Latin served a very different function for Richard Ligon when he began his 3-year sojourn in Barbados in 1647. Better born than Thistlewood, his cousins included the Barclay and Gorges families, who produced an early governor of colonial Virginia and the original recipient of the charter for the province of Maine. Ligon showed the social functions of a classical education when his patron, Sir Thomas Moderford, wrote a letter of thanks in Latin to the island's governor, Padre Vagado, for getting the English expedition out of a jam caused by a treacherous Portuguese guide. The Padre tried his best to respond in proper written Latin, but as Ligon sardonically noted, he fell two bows short, substance and language. And though his quarrel were to us, yet he revenged himself on Priscian, whose head he broke 3 or 4 times in his letter. Priscian was the 5th century Latin grammarian whose institutes of grammar had long been considered the leading authority on the language. Ligon's joke about the Padre's poor Latin thus at least partially draws on a sense of deep-seated authority that he, an educated, well-connected gentleman, possessed, and that the mysterious Padre, whose family consisted of a mulatto of his own getting, 3 Negroes, a fiddler, and a wench, did not. That's from Ligon's description. Ligon's late Renaissance classicism is allusional, allowing him to speak from within a community of the properly acculturated and comfortably inserting him into a line of historical descent that equips him to name the relationships around him and to decipher the strange new world he is about to enter. Moved by the sight of Barbados's magnificent royal palms, which could grow to a height of nearly 200 feet, he remarked that if this earth were beautiful, smooth, and large enough, it might be called the pedestal to that Corinthian pillar, the Palmetto Royal. The explosion of fronds at the top of a royal palm reminds him of the highly ornamented capital of a Corinthian pillar, as he reduces the lush Barbadian landscape to the status of a stage setting for the classically inflected grandeur his description imposes upon it. Unfortunately, Barbados's dense forests and the songbirds they hosted were all gone within about 25 years of Liggon's arrival, cut down to clear land for planting sugarcane. Liggon's history smoothly appropriates such violent deforestation to its invocation of ancient forms, but it encounters more difficulty when it tries to understand Barbados's people and the relationships he can have with them within those pre-existing frames of reference. A group of pretty young Negro virgins playing about a well strike him as nymphs whose graceful beauty would challenge the skill of Dürer or Titian to portray accurately. The sight of these girls has somehow yanked him backwards from his own time and thrust him into an Arcadian glade, which he thought, while he thought he'd been on his way to a tropical settlement. Time and history blur. Liggon had earlier been impressed by the majesty and natural elegance of Padre Bragado's beautiful Black mistress, as he describes her, but he insists that these young nymphs affected him even more powerfully. An older woman might counsel and persuade a gentleman into offering his love to her, but young, fresh beauties like those at the well force and so commit rapes upon our affections, he writes. The word rapes in his description jumps right off the page here, knowing what we know about Black women's lives in the early Caribbean. However, Liggon uses the word in an expansive, oblique sense that refers backward to its Latin meaning of taking something or someone by force, more than it does to the sexual violation that formed so much of the fabric of plantation life. His use also strips the word of much of the gravity it carries in Roman accounts of imperial origins. Ovid's Fasti tells us that the Sabine men's decision to attack Rome in retaliation for their daughters having been lured to the city through deceit and then seized as wives by Rome's founders was the first time did a father wage war upon his daughters' husbands. In attacking the Sabines' fathers would be compounding a violation of their own rules of family connection, because now the ravished brides could claim the style of mothers also, and yet the war between kindred folks kept lingering on. In this classical account, rape has an afterlife that will shadow the reproductive future that Romulus and his followers believed they guaranteed by kidnapping the Sabines. Because of the way they believe sex operates in civil order, the Sabines' father must now recognize the men who kidnapped and raped their daughters as kindred, whether they want to or not. In comparison, the notion of raptus that Liggon invokes denudes the act of its sorrow, both in Roman history and in the history of his own time. His story paints him as the victim who will be figuratively instead of literally carried away, and the girls as smiling aggressors who don't intend him any real harm. They have not resorted to violence. No one has been abducted or coerced into placating their rapist for fear of their children's safety. Instead, he, and not these Black girls at the well, has been carried away. A willing victim of their charm, he gives them what trinkets he has about them and offers them strong English spirits, which they dilute with water before they drink. He knows they want to speak to him. They wanted neither wit nor discretion to make an answer. Even though they pulled themselves into the modestest postures that could be after accepting his gifts, he could tell by their wanton smiles and gesticulations that they wanted to increase their acquaintance with him. He knows just by looking at them, but they did not speak. He stands before them in the passage that he cuts off here, his drink in his hand, suspended in desire. Unlike Thistlewood, Ligon never writes about his actual sex life. To be sure, he even seems to retract his insistence on the attraction between him and the group of Black girls at the well, explaining that he had written under the influence of their powerful allure and of the extravagance of the tropical landscape that hosted them. The place being extreme, beautiful, and lovely could not but secretly harbor in it the spirit of love, a passion not to be governed. The girls at the well belong to an order of nature in which desire is imminent. They effortlessly embody it and aim it at his vulnerable heart. Anyway, people shouldn't take him too seriously because the island, being a place of very little or no traffic, could not afford much of discourse. He was only joking, he says, in a rhetorical move that's taken on new life in contemporary politics, as defenders of reactionary or racist statements insist without evidence that the speaker didn't really mean it. Here, Ligon withdraws his implication of cross-racial sexual contact almost as soon as he makes it. The Black nymphs at the tropical well implicitly offer themselves, but Ligon declines their advances after presenting himself as a sure and willing participant in the courtship dance they initiate. He is their sexual victim, perhaps not an unwilling one, but the object of their assertive desire nonetheless. What this Arcadian fantasy tells us is the degree to which, even at this early point in British settlement in Barbados, the notion of slave women's natural wantonness has achieved an ideological life of its own that works to excuse the ways in which white men act on their own desires. A conviction of enslaved women's innate immodesty and their exclusion from normal orders of civic or even human status will enable the sexual terror that helped slave cultures proclaim and sustain white supremacy. And we do see some of this later on in Ligon's work, his History of Barbados. But even at the middle of the 17th century, we can see how deeply the belief in Black women's sexual aggression was inscribed into stories about colonial desire, displacing white men's predation and entitlement onto them. I know that my title promised you a talk about finding Black women in Shakespeare. As a girl Shakespeare nerd raised in a world of Black possibility, I assumed that I would find Black women in Shakespeare, having grown up on stories about real life heroes and rebels like Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer, watching Barbara Jordan in the Watergate hearings and Angela Davis on trial and Shirley Chisholm running for president, but I didn't. So I started reading, since I was very interested at the time in works dealing with Rome's imperial encounters with Africa and the East. I found myself looking for Renaissance stories about Sophonisba, the Carthaginian noblewoman who committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner and forced to walk in Roman triumph. She's a major character in Petrarch's late 14th century epic, Africa. I read and reread the Aeneid, especially Book 4, emphasized in Shakespeare's grammar school education, where Aeneas consummates his great love for Dido, Carthage's queen, and then breaks both their hearts by leaving her to continue his mission to found an empire greater than Troy. I read a number of plays about Rome's encounters in Egypt, with their shifting love political triangles: Caesar, Cleopatra, Pompey; Caesar, Cleopatra, Antony; Cleopatra, Antony, Octavius. I read and reread, and I'm still reading Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, set on that path by the same kind of scorn that Professor Haley expressed for critics and scholars who tried to evade or dismiss the possibility of Blackness manifesting anywhere in one of their sacred texts by insisting that the Egyptian queen was really Greek. And so we didn't have to talk about this at all. Reading these Renaissance tales of African empire, I thought I would find Black women in the texts and the period I loved. But the more reading I did, the more obvious it became that my assumption was wrong. Instead, what I found was that Sophonisba and Dido of Carthage in modern-day Tunisia and Cleopatra of Egypt were all explicitly described as white, ivory-skinned and golden-haired, and I began to wonder why. Regardless of what ancient Carthaginians or Egyptians might have looked like or how they described themselves, why were my texts so insistent on physically describing all these women as white? Why had even the possibility of their Blackness, or at least that they were not white, been made to disappear? But as Fred Moten reminds us, disappearance is not absence. Even though so few Black women appear on stage in Shakespeare and his contemporaries, even in the classically set texts where we might expect to find them, they are still called on to do all kinds of work furthering the symbolic logic of his plots. They are there and they matter, even though they don't physically appear. Blackness and Black femininity were necessary to make whiteness visible, as I intuited when I realized that the literary vogue for descriptions of white female virtue overlapped with the appearance of ethnographic descriptions of Black female degradation. The selective management of the classical archive is another means through which Black female subjects were reproduced for the purposes of empire and of the race-based slavery which supported it. I believe that in the century after Ligon, classical imitation reaches the end of its utility as a tool for the representation of the place of Black women in the ancient world, for reasons I'd be glad to talk about later. Museums, poet Robin Cost Lewis tells us, are invisible graveyards, crammed with the broken, defaced, unseen bodies of Black women reduced to decorative traces. We are everywhere, she writes. Perhaps our knowledge of how classical literatures and texts and forms permeate Renaissance literature, as common and unremarked upon for us now as the manifestations of Roman and Greek dominion, Professor de Montero described her students discovering all around them in post offices and high schools and city halls. Perhaps the knowledge of the presence of classical literature and text can become a tool for early modernists, for us to find and excavate the Black presences that have been deliberately lost. I'll stop there.
Just want to thank my fellow panelists. Those were two fantastic papers. I'm honored to be on this panel. I also want to thank the hosts and the coalition of scholars and activists that have brought us together for Race Before Race. This has been a fantastic conference thus far, not just the wonderful, brilliant talks, but also the framing, the art, the music. So just thrilled to be part of this. I'm coming to you from Richmond, Virginia, the land of the Algonquian peoples and those confederated under Powhatan. This is a short journey from historical Jamestown, where in 1619, the English colonists brought enslaved Africans to the region. Lamentably, this is also the home of the Confederate allegiance against the United States, which fought with the United States between 1861 and 1865. And then even into the early 20th century, this was the home of the lost cause and still remains in many ways the home of the lost cause. I want to give you a little context for what I'm about to present. As many of us, George Floyd's death, his killing in May 25, 2020, really jarred many of us. And first, it raised the question of where we were in relation to the past. I also began to wonder where this was in relation to one of the fields I study, which is American theater, and began to go back first to Blues for Mr. Charlie, James Baldwin's Blues for Mr. Charlie, the 1964 play in which Baldwin was attempting to come to terms with the slaughter of Emmett Till. This poster in front of you is by the artist Jesse Smith, who is the owner, those of who have heard me throughout the year talking about this, owner of a tattoo parlor in Richmond, Virginia called Loose Screw. He painted this mural on plywood, paying homage to the deceased. And Smith and many others painted images and words on plywood that was meant to protect storefronts from, ostensibly, from destruction, writing such words as solidarity for George Floyd, along with the logo of Black Lives Matter all across what is known in Richmond, Virginia as Carytown. So I began to go back, beginning in '64, Blues for Mr. Charlie, and have crafted a work on plays that began with Blues for Mr. Charlie all the way up to the present. And I was interested in first, again, understanding James Baldwin's Blues and how this related to the murder of Emmett Till. Yesterday, or 2 days ago, Scott Manning Stevens spoke to us about periodization. We were thinking about the classical or antiquity and the periodization of early modern. You'll find in what I'm showing you right now a periodization as well. That is a framework of our own memory, my own past, beginning in 71 when I was born, but also strolling through some memories as I relate to these events as well. So you won't hear that much in the paper, but it's there, very much present in my own mind and in what I'm trying to work out. And then theater. Why theater? Theater has been a place, as this quote on Rousseau text tells us, of all the arts, one with the richest history of conflict with the defenders of morality, both theological and philosophical, is theater. It has been where we project our cultural and collective fantasies. And this also has been the case when it comes to the classics. It's how the culture imagines the classics in many ways, whether Greek drama or Shakespeare, and these get built in our imagination. I'm reminded also of Lyra Montero's provocation about how we know the Greeks are white. In the same way, I was interested in the period of the 90s and the attempt, however unsuccessful, to undo this knowing. That is in a period beginning in the 1990s, and I don't have statistics on this, so I can't really tell you how many plays and whether or not the 80s and 90s were a period of more presentations of Greek drama with Black bodies, with Black actors, but it certainly was a period where this was happening. And I show you a little summary from Steve Carter's Pecan, which is from Kevin Wetmore's work called Black Dionysus, which is interested in the staging of Black plays on the American stage. Think about Rita Dove's The Darker Face of the Earth. And Wetmore was specifically interested in the Black embodiment of classical plays on the American stage. I wrote a book published in 2013 where I was trying to also understand where other playwrights, maybe perhaps not Black playwrights, were not necessarily doing classical reception, but were also staging Black bodies on the stage and what this might mean. So in front of you, think of these plays, these classical plays, Rita Dove, Stephen Carter, in light of what was also going on during the period. Anna Devere Smith's Fires in the Mirror, which I'll talk a little bit about, not much, but this is also Bringing the Noise, Bringing the Funk, 1995, and so on. All of this called me back then to August Wilson's 1996 keynote address for the Theater Communications Group, moving forward to what I'm doing now, in which he asserted that Black playwrights should write plays that tell of the experiences of Black people in the United States, and that Black actors should play the roles of characters in those experiences. In the speech in which he made this assertion, The Ground on Which I Stand, he begins with the classical and immediately juxtaposes it to contemporary. He says, I'll show you that in a moment. He says, in one guise, quote, in one guise, the ground on which I stand has been pioneered by Greek dramatists, by Euripides, Aeschylus, and Sophocles, by William Shakespeare, by Shaw and Ibsen, and by the American dramatist Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Miller, and Tennessee Williams. In another guise, the ground on which I stand has been pioneered by my grandfather, by Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, by Martin Delaney, Marcus Garvey, and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, end of quote. In the chapter of Theater in Crisis, the book I'm working on now, which I'm presenting today, I provoke the cultural memory of the 1980s and 1990s in the United States and situate theater as a cultural site of recall. By no means comprehensive, the chapter offers a model for how inheritors of American theater might understand the early 2020s. The 1980s and 1990s were a time when the debates of an earlier generation, those who fought for civil rights and protested the war in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, seemed to be center stage once again. The chapter samples the kinds of ideas that were popular during these 2 decades, and in particular, the vaunt of a colorblind society. I first traced the fantasy of a colorblind society, which allows further contextualization of plays like Stephen Carter's Pecan or Rita Dove's Darker Face of the Earth, which debuted in 1996 with its Black enslaved Oedipus and white slave owner mother set on a Southern plantation. Wilson's objection to these kinds of plays makes more sense with the passage of time and once we can reconstruct the contemporary public discourse around them. Whereas classicists like Frank M. Snowden Jr. clamor for a colorblind society, books from the period, like Alan Bloom's 1987, The Closing of the American Mind, How Higher Education Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students, unearth the racial roots, the very present realities, and the pernicious impact of such a discourse. Halfway through his keynote address for the Theater Communications Group, Wilson might well have alarmed his audience when he asserted the following, that, here you have it, colorblind casting is an aberrant idea that has never had any validity other than as a tool of the cultural imperialists who view their American culture rooted in the icons of European culture as beyond reproach in its perfection. To those theater practitioners who assert that they do not see color, Wilson retorts, quote, "We want you to see us," unquote. He rejects the idea that white people, quote, "carry that much spiritual weight," unquote, that all other people can be grouped together in contrast as if, quote, one white person balances out the rest of humanity lumped together as nondescript people of color, end quote. Where Wilson was taking his audience was a sharp detour from his opening words, his focus on grounds fertilization by Greek dramatists, by Euripides, by Aeschylus, and Sophocles. But he had warned them with the insurrectionists Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. Wilson's detour from the Greek playwrights and the European and American greats, incidentally all men, to what he calls the Black Power movement of the 1960s. He calls this the kiln in which I was fired. This detour would no doubt jar his white critics who might have been along for the ride, such as Robert Brustein, the one-time dean of the Yale School of Drama and founder of the Yale Repertory Theater. In 1964, Brustein had attacked James Baldwin in print within 4 months of the closing of Blues for Mr. Charlie. A year earlier in '63, Baldwin had also been bringing fire from his own kiln with the publication of The Fire Next Time. And Brustein described him as belligerent, going after his person rather than his ideas. This time it was Wilson's turn. And in his crosshairs was Brustein's 1993 article from the New Republic called On Theater, Unity from Diversity. Wilson takes issue with Brustein's notion that sociological criteria, his words, Brustein's words, sociological criteria were overriding aesthetic criteria in the funding of theater. And this was lowering the standards, according to Brustein, lowering the standards rather than broadening perspectives. Brustein had no time for Wilson or his Black Power colleagues and would describe him as angry during the 1997 debate subsequent to the keynote, later conceding that, quote, "I was not prepared to meet a man of such quality." And if you ever watch Wilson, if you listen to him or watch this debate, this is the calmest man you'll ever see. Much has been made of the debate between Wilson and Brustein that ensued after the keynote. In the chapter, I put the debate over theater in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s in the broader cultural conversation, what was called the culture war of the period. Brustein's language of producing theater of proven quality during the debate parallels language of merit. So here again, he sees people as individuals, not as groups, as you see in front of you. He calls for a color blindness and rejects these sociological criteria over aesthetic ones. Brustein advances the idea of standards of excellence, color blindness. By contrast, Wilson's audience was audibly taken aback when he condemned colorblind casting, chiding Black actors who took roles in prominent white productions. These actors would, quote, create an illusion rather than face the harsh and uncompromising truth about ourselves, unquote. The moderator of the debate was Anna Devere Smith, the very author of Fires in the Mirror. This was a documentary, a one-woman documentary, one-person documentary about the death of a Black child, Gavin Cato, who had been struck by a car driven by a Jewish member of the Crown Heights community. And this play had won a number of awards and had been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Even she is noticeably taken aback, asking Wilson whether there might not be a, quote, another position, unquote. Wilson takes issue with this juxtaposition and insists on a rejection of colorblindness. There is in his position a precursor to the current idea of color consciousness. Wilson again says, remember, we want you to see us. Factor in my Blackness. I hope I was hired because I was Black. Rereading Wilson's position within the current cultural moment, I am struck in ways that I had not been before by the resonance between this colorblind fantasy that he rejects and a projection of colorblindness onto ancient Greece and Rome that was happening during the same exact period of the 1980s and 1990s. And as I intimated before, the groundwork for this was actually going on even earlier, the post-World War II, coming into the 1960s and 1970s. I want to show you now a little bit of an obituary of Harvard-educated classical scholar Frank Snowden, who taught at Howard University beginning in 1940 for about 50 years. Snowden, a Black man, called in this obituary a rarity in the classics, of course, known for Blacks in antiquity, known for before color prejudice. Now, the United States President George W. Bush's awarding of Snowden with the National Humanities Medal in 2003 speaks not only to the scholar's broader cultural significance outside of academia, but also to the warm embrace of arguments of colorblindness within the cultures and the country's political right. Putting the past to use in diagnosing America's sickness, Snowden projected the fantasy of a colorblind society onto antiquity. And you see in front of you that he was contending that racial prejudice, at least as it is defined today, was largely unknown in antiquity. Scholarship in the early 21st century, as another obituary puts it, contextualizes the development of Snowden's race relations thesis, namely that, quote, America, prevented by racism from living up to its founding values, could be redeemed by looking to the ancient world, unquote, unquote. Within its broader cultural context, this was happening during the politics, within the politics of the early Cold War. And I'll skip over a section here, but just to further contextualize Snowden, he is part of a volume called The Image of the Black in Western Art. And I am struck by the way, for example, he talks about the Negro in ancient society, using the American term, the Negro, which maps onto such categorizations as Carl Linnaeus's 18th century Homo Americanus, Homo Africanus, and so on. We can think of David Hume here as well. He goes on in that article to talk about two types of Negro. He calls one the pure African with Negroid characteristics, in talking about the art, the representational art of what Black people in the ancient world. And he calls a second type the Nilotic type of mixed phenotype. False ethnic and racial ideas of pure and mixed pervade Snowden's narrative and his description of these ancient images, pots, sculpture, and so on. Throughout eugenic discourse of the early 20th century, pure racial types are diluted or augmented through mixing across gene pools. Discourse and practices of whitening exist across the Americas and come to be the foundation of the Third Reich in Germany, as we know. Snowden ultimately deploys these categories to antiquity, enlisting Greece and Rome in the 1970s and 1980s in the fight against American racism and the country's dehumanization of Blacks, Negroes, or African American. He asks his readers to note the beauty and grace bestowed in antiquity upon even everyday objects of African subjects. Although Snowden maintained throughout his career that race bias was a relatively modern phenomenon, his work focused on the idealization of the past as a site of utopic return, rather than on what it might take to undo the racism of the present. And he experienced this in his own, we can talk about some of the experiences he himself had. But he was also American ambassador in Rome from 1954 to 1956. He gave lectures for the US Department of State in West and North Africa, in Egypt, Italy, Greece, Austria, India, Brazil. And he was helping to maintain a positive image of the United States to the world, at the same time as a Malcolm X, for example, and later Martin Luther King Jr. were undoing that positive image and criticizing America's role in the world, on the world stage. Subsequent to his official role in the 1950s, Snowden would continue to project a fantasy that post-civil rights America could become once again like Greece and Rome. This illusion, however, met the harsh realities of the time. He became, by the 60s, he was being criticized by what one obituary calls, quote, more militant students and teachers for his disapproval of Afrocentrism, unquote. He demurred from critique of contemporary cultural practices in the United States, an evasion that helps to explain his distaste for Martin Brunell, who took a more militant tack in his 3-volume work, Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, which he began to publish in 1987. Meanwhile, by the 1970s, Snowden was being hung in effigy at Howard University and had to resign his deanship. And this is perhaps a little bit of background on how he might have encountered Shelley Haley. Shelley Haley speaks about an encounter with Snowden a couple of days ago when she gave her talk. So this might give you a little bit of a sense of that encounter. Through it all, Snowden never seemed to evolve his position, never even mounting a criticism of Greeks and Romans as proto-Westerners. If Snowden hesitated to take on his contemporaries, he could easily have located the roots of modern racism and the enslavement of African people in antiquity. Such a robust and scaffolded appraisal of the United States never emerged from him. Although Snowden would look to antiquity for a pristine origin story, by 1972, his soon-to-be nemesis had secured a faculty position at a stronghold of the resistance to Western civilization, quote unquote. It is noteworthy that Martin Brunell arrived at Cornell University just 3 years after a student protest that would be remembered as one of the most damaging to the proponents of meritocracy and a colorblind society. A precursor to the Kent State University protests of 1970, the events at Cornell University in 1969 echo in the academic writing of the 80s and 90s. In the closing of The American Mind, 1987, Alan Bloom notes that, quote, at Cornell and elsewhere, the Black militants had to threaten and to do bodily harm to Black students with independent inclinations, unquote. Cornell was one of the dozen top schools that figured in the data of the bell curve, intelligence and class structure in American life. The authors of this book that was broadly critiqued not only as racist, but bad psychology, locate their ideal readers as among that small population of, that small proportion of the nation's population that are able to attend universities like Cornell. It is to these people that they raise the question of individual ability upon which advancement in society should be based. Writing for the Hoover Institute in 1999, Senior Institute Fellow Thomas Sowell sees April 20th, 1969, when what he calls bands of militant Black students took over Willard Straight Hall as, quote, the day Cornell died, unquote. 20 years later, Sowell laments the tragedy, as he calls it, that began as, quote, one of those good intentions with the road to hell, on which the road to hell is paved, unquote, arguing that unqualified Black students, unlike himself, a well-credentialed Black, corrupted the university. From Sowell's perspective, individual merit and good conduct trump race, such that he never noticed, quote, the pervasive racism that Black students supposedly encountered at every turn on campus and in town, unquote. Rather, he states that how people conduct themselves has something to do with how others react. This is the messy environment that Bernal enters when he takes a job at Cornell University 3 years later in 1972. And this is rehearsed. Snowden Bernal is something that classicists know well about. Those who look back to the period know about, but it's interesting to put this now in the context of the broader cultural dialogue of the time, and particularly this notion of a colorblind society, whether on stage in terms of colorblind casting or projecting back to antiquity as a period of colorblindness. This is not the place to rehearse arguments in Black Athena, but it is intriguing how animated Snowden's response was, given that Bernal had not taken the Greeks and Romans of his fantasy, he had not taken them on, but rather Bernal had taken on contemporary culture, the culture in which they both lived and breathed. Each could see the backlash against affirmative action, most notably in the 1978 Supreme Court decision in Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, the ruling in favor of a broad and wide-ranging criteria of diversity over affirmative action, which would be upheld in subsequent decisions. Each person could judge for himself how the unequal and segregated realities of the so-called races in the 1980s and 1990s came about. It was Cornell's Bernal, however, not Snowden, who exposes the myth of origin for the contemporary scene and places that myth in the 18th and 19th century under the construct of civilization. This civilization which excludes Blacks and excludes Semitic people. From the somewhat removed perspective of the 2010s, take a look quickly at part of an obituary that ran for Martin Bernal in the New York Times, with this perspective now being able to put him in the context of the culture of his time. The writer writes, Black Athena opened a new front in the warfare over cultural diversity already raging on American campuses in the 1980s and 1990s. The first volume, published in 1987, the same year as the closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom's attack on efforts to diversify the academic canon, made Mr. Bernal a hero among Afrocentrists. There was that throwaway Afrocentrist framework, a pariah among conservative scholars, and the star witness at dozens of sometimes raucous academic panel discussions about how to teach the foundations of Western civilization. This 2013 contextualization of a seemingly arcane debate within universities in the United States, and even there within the ivory tower of academic disciplines, the classics, was not wholly possible during the 1980s and 1990s. The relationship between and among these conversations, however, is now clear. By rejecting questions of quality and of color blindness, which was a signal to individual exceptionalism over racial equity, August Wilson was already affirming his understanding of the context. And I want to wrap up by showing you the debate within today's context. Right after George Floyd's murder, many of you might know that there are now BIPOC demands for white American theater, which was published about a year ago now, going on a year ago, a living document that makes demands on theater. And I'm struck by the contrast still between Bruce Stein, who says that in his debate with Wilson, art does not change anything, in contrast to Wilson, who claims that the politics of art is camouflaged, it's hidden. Rejecting colorblind casting, rejecting colorblind plays. I leave you with this framework as we wonder what it might mean to cast, for example, classical plays with Black bodies, what these plays in the 1980s and 1990s might say to us, what this periodization that I'm giving you might give us, might tell us, and how much embedded in that same period to a great extent we still are.
Thank you very much for that paper, Patrice, for your paper, Roland, and for your paper, Joyce. Those were just absolutely wonderful. And I think we're going to get a lot out of talking about those papers together and looking at their intersections. We do have a couple questions starting to come in the chat, in the Q&A box. And I encourage you, if you're thinking about a question, to gather it up and send it to us in that Q&A box. But I thought it might make a lot of sense for us to sort of start things off here by creating space for our panelists to ask anything that's come to mind of one another as they've heard each other's papers. So I just want to make that space. Patrice, Joyce, Roland, anything you want to hear from one another?
Yeah, what immediately jumped to my mind in Patrice's paper is questions of colorblind casting, particularly in Shakespearean production. Have you done any work on that? Because to me, that's just such a permanently interesting question that requires, so much pre-work and pre-planning, much more than it often gets in action.
Yeah, even today, I was struck by just a kind of throwaway popular movie with Michael B. Jordan, where the Tom Clancy movie that came out last weekend, where he was being interviewed and the character was not meant to be a Black character. And Michael B. Jordan now has clout. So he was able to tell the director that he had to add a line about the way that Blacks who serve in the military are treated when they come home. And this is the case post-World War II. It's the case in Vietnam, Korea, all the way up to the present. So, I mean, yes, there's a lot of work on colorblind casting in Shakespeare. And of course, the sort of notion of colorblind casting in theater is maybe one might argue a very different matter from, let's say, a Frank Snowden's projection of a colorblind society onto the ancient Greece. What I want to suggest is that they're not different matters at all. And that August Wilson actually he was on to something. I would say he had it right. Maybe some might disagree. But what he was talking about was a rejection of those stories in favor of telling stories that that theater he felt needed to make space for. Think of his 10th century plays, stories of characters that we hadn't seen or heard before, or even, for example, the kinds of characters and people, personalities that your paper point to. What would it mean to enliven those characters, those people, those personalities in thinking about the period and thinking about Shakespeare's period and so on. So I think he was talking about moving away from an obsession with Greek texts, Shakespeare, the classics, toward a reconstruction of the space, which is not to say that there isn't efficacy and a lot of value and worth to casting Black characters in ostensibly non-Black roles. But he was moving on to something a little different.
Imagining a whole Black world in which characters don't have to fit into someone else's story.
So your paper made me think, for example, of Othello and his mother and the handkerchief, which he says his mother gave him. What would it mean to open up that space to understand the culture from which he's coming, and what it might mean to kind of give 3 dimensions to an Othello that has a grounding and a rooting in a different cultural praxis and a different cultural point of origin than European.
Yeah, don't get me started. This is this is a subject I've written and thought a lot about, these missing Black women in Othello who have basically made him the person that he is today. But who are sort of the story remembers them, but they are not physically there. They are disappeared, but they're not absent.
Thank you for that.
By the way, we do want to get you started. That's where we want.
Thanks for asking that question, though, Patrice. I was wondering, Joyce, Roland, is there anything you want to ask of Patrice or of one another before we move into audience questions?
Let me jump in and ask Roland. I was trying to look up your book while you were talking, and I see your chapter in there on eunuchs and these sort of people who are, for these various political processes, this biopower of the state has been operated on them. Do you see these sorts of contemporary white supremacists' uses of Byzantium? Do they have anything to say about gender and sexuality, or are they all about racism and Islamophobia? Is there a place for gender or sexuality in their accounts of the past?
That's the really fascinating part of it, that those aspects are overlooked. And it's terrible stuff to do, but just like going through these threads and like searching for keywords like eunuchs, out of all the posts that talk about the Byzantine Empire, there's maybe like 1 or 2. And here I am thinking, with all the sort of like obsession with like blood drinking pedophiles, like, wouldn't you want to like operate on the idea that the eunuchs are a problem and like this and that? And that's completely absent. And I think that's what's really communicates a lot to me about what this is, how this is being used. And in my original title I had the far right's whitewashed Byzantium, and then I took it off in my key slide because I was like, seems redundant in some extent.
Yeah.
And I was, that's one of the really fascinating aspects. And I think one of the key things that we really need to keep in mind, and it's hard, to always have to I could give pages and pages of just background on Byzantium and its place, is that Byzantium is both Western and non-Western, depending on how a European Middle Ages is being construed. And so because of that, its fluidity and a lot of it from ignorance comes into this idea that in some spaces it can be fully Western and therefore fully European in its modes. And so the eunuchs sort of fall off as something that you're not thinking about. Whereas it's interesting because the history of Byzantium in theater, in its representations, has always been deeply enmeshed with Orientalist tropes. And I'm thinking of like Sardou's play of Theodora in the late 19th century. There's always been this language. And so it's really fascinating that the gender and the sexuality that emerges from conceptions of gender in Byzantium that we see so prominently in the historiography from the mid-20th century before that is completely purged out of this narrative. And that's like what for me is really telling of what these lineages are, because these sort of like hyper masculine narratives that are sort of more being taken as an assumption come out from, the sort of like Russian Moscow sphere of like Third Rome, and we are the rightful inheritors, to Constantinople as Second Rome. And so it's a very different genealogy for these narratives, which I think says a lot about how information is being shared and so forth. But yeah, thank you. That's like at the heart of all this.
Yeah, I was thinking of all those photographs of Putin with his shirt off, being the sort of, super manly man leader of Russia. And I'm surprised that that's not more visible in this white supremacist.
Exactly. And it's difficult to go into that, especially when you're, writing conspiracy theories about the US, and that, your opposition is writing conspiracy theories about Russia. And so I think that in that like sort of mediation, a lot of the sort of heritage of this idea is reworked in ways that are complex, because I think that in some ways anyone who's working with these texts, unless you're just Googling a term and not thinking about it beyond that, they must be encountering these lineages and having to sort of like weave their way to create a narrative. I think Byzantium, what fascinates me about Byzantium as an area of study is that it is unruly and it is difficult to work with. And that's whether you're working on issues of gender, sexuality, and race, or if you're writing conspiracy theories about it, it has minefields in it. And it's very interesting to see this sort of vision of Byzantium so clearly articulated. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Let's move into some of the questions we have from the audience. And the first one I'm going to go with is for Professor MacDonald, if my cat will get out of the way long enough for me to read it. And let's see. Yes. All right. I wonder if Professor MacDonald could speak on Black women's presence in Shakespeare through their absence. This is a question from Lucy Braverman, and it's something that struck me in your talk as well. If you could elaborate a bit on exactly how this presence works.
Okay. Patrice brought up Othello, which I think is a really canonical moment. As I read Othello, it seems to me that so much of the tragedy comes from the way that Othello understands love to be, that it's this kind of cosmic force that can guide the universe. And it's his understanding of love is what's been passed down to him by his mother, who gave him the handkerchief and told him the secret: if you hold on to this, she'll always love you. It was the handkerchief, the embroidery on the handkerchief was made by a sorceress. There is someone who endowed the handkerchief with another woman who endowed the handkerchief with erotic magic. So it's as though Othello's understanding of what love is, the thing that sets him up makes him susceptible to Iago, the thing that sets him up for tragedy. His whole view of the world has been shaped for him by the women in his life. They are central to his formation of a character, and yet they are physically absent from the story. What we do see in the story, especially in the moment in the first folio version anyway, where Desdemona sings the Willow Song. She says, this was a song that was my mother's maid Barbary was always singing. And when you see her name Barbary, it could be an abbreviation for the English name Barbara. But in this play that sort of spreads all over the eastern end of the Mediterranean, you're also tempted, I am, to think of this in connection with Barbary territories. Was this maid Barbary also another one of these missing Black women? And to me, the moment in F1, it's where we see Desdemona trying to sing this song is really powerful, because she's trying to imitate Barbary as she sings it. She's trying to imitate her physical posture as she leans all to one side. So she's trying to look like her, but she can't remember the words. And so what we've got is this kind of second order imitation of yet another absent Black woman, where Desdemona's personal understanding of love's frailties and love's proneness to disaster is mapped over another romantic artifact from a different world, a world in which this possibly Black woman, Barbary, was singing out of her own experience. The actual Barbary is missing from the text. What we have is instead is the white woman Desdemona trying to approximate that song and reproduce it for her own purposes, which are, legitimate purposes. The man she loves has suddenly turned on her, but they are also purposes which are very different from that bigger cosmic scene that this world of Black women that Othello has come from maps about love. So it seems to me that Othello is a really good example of how Black women are present, and yet they are physically absent. Their doings, their work is essential to the ways in which we understand the story, and yet they themselves have been dispensed with and sort of reproduced in this second order way by Desdemona's attempt, say, to perform Barbary's song, the Willow Song. So it's a sort of a white character, a white woman being mapped over the work and the shaping of a Black one. I hope that's responsive to the question that the person asked.
I think very much so. It also strikes me, coming from the perspective of a medievalist, that what's going on there is you also have these spectral Black women carrying with them the history of the Eastern origins of romance convention, the Eastern origins of the idea of courtly love. And so that this is, embedded in the text, this history, the recognition of origin is embedded in the text through the shadows of the Black women who are present in their absence. Yeah. So thank you so much for that choice. I want to next voice a question for Professor Betancourt. This is the writer Bianca Calabresi thanks Professor Betancourt for his wonderful presentation. And says that they've been charting similar uses of the 1571 Battle of, hold on here, technology is messing with me. Yes. The 1571 Battle of Lepanto on social media by white supremacists and alt-right militia in the US over the last 5 years. Have you seen any overlap of these Islamophobic histories, or are they histories in scare quotes, or are they circulating among different hate groups and in different alt-right contexts?
That's a great question that stirs up a lot of thoughts for me. I haven't seen in my mind that I've registered any particular references to the Battle of Lepanto that's stuck with me. I will say that what this question also sort of spurs me on to think very deeply about is what are our methods for thinking about these types of strange passing citations that become sort of these odd fixations and recur, and so you can't just dismiss them as passing, but yet are sort of so removed from a context or a sort of concise iteration of history in these types of far-right discourses. And in many ways, even listening to Professor MacDonald's talk, and particularly the Corinthian pillar stuck with me, and the use of Latin. I'm also someone who's working on a project on thinking on sort of what I'm vaguely calling simulacral spaces, from theme parks to spaces like Las Vegas and the uses of history there. And I see such a striking parallel in this sort of method of working with historical fragments, and how the fragments are sort of stretched over these worlds, reworking landscape to understand it within past tropes. And oftentimes these fragments can be scaled up to an entire world, sort of refracted through that small prism. And they produce these sort of suspended disbelief spaces of not only space and time, and thinking about places like, Las Vegas with like the Venetian Hotel creating a sort of like late medieval Venice, but also, these white supremacist narratives of reworking a terrain into a sort of landscape that is different than what you have there in these models. I often think that it also reminds me of what I see with students when, you begin the learning process, especially in visual culture, where with a limited vocabulary, you see something everywhere because you don't have the vocabulary to distinguish and talk about richly. And that's something that for me becomes very pressing in how I deal with these types of appropriation of history is like, how do we give meaning to something that is used so meaningless and without sort of historical context and depth and nuance, but that still is able to dilate itself to create this sort of like world making spaces. And I think that's one of the difficulties about thinking about these painful archives is that, and sort of treacherous archives, that is, how do we give on them the respect we need to give them in order to treat them seriously? And I mean respect in the sense of like, no, this isn't a passing citation, no, this isn't insignificant, let's actually see how much we can think through this to understand what is happening here. And so that really makes me think a lot about how these sort of, particularly the Islamophobic histories, take on certain spaces of these broader European medieval and early modern narratives that fit into spaces that are often sort of removed from main histories that are being articulated, whether it be a sort of notion of a classical past or something else. And so for me, I don't have an answer to specifically the Battle of Lepanto, but this question really urged me to think a lot about our sort of methods and sort of what is the sort of epistemology of conspiracy that exists in these types of working with history, which is very unique than what we have seen in other spaces, but has still a very long history that I think is very unique in some ways to the United States in its sort of cultural capitalism, culture of capitalism, and particularly the late 20th century.
Thank you for that, Roland. I want to pick up on two threads and then turn us to some of the questions that pick up on those threads. One of them is, as you talked about, you mentioned world-making spaces. Mm-hmm. And we have a question here that's directed, it's really very much about theater, from Owen Williams, and it's directed toward Professors Rankine and MacDonald. From your perception of the reception of the demands that anti-racists and BIPOC actors and theater professionals are making on the theater industry to build an anti-racist theater and other such initiatives, do you think contemporary theater is poised to radically shift perceptions of race in the United States?
Patrice, you're probably could probably give a more nuanced answer about this than I do. But I will say that one of the areas I work in with performance is about adapted performance. And there's always been just such a vigorous history of Black people acting in Shakespeare. Now, this is an example of the kind of Black people putting themselves into classical canonical performances that someone like August Wilson would decry and say there's not any point in doing this. But I would also say that one of the effects of Black adaptation, rethinking, reperformance, remaking of Shakespeare can be to take him and put him into a different set of cultural terms, a different set of assumptions, a different set of audience expectations. And so that seems to me to do some of the work of making Shakespeare Black, of opening this sort of hallowed special cultural space and saying, well, this is a Black space too. And in a way, sort of making the preeminence of the Shakespeare text almost secondary to the vigor and the presence of the performance. I'm sure that Patrice has more to say about that.
Well, that was really helpful. I think rather than the question of whether theater is poised to, I might even say theater must. What I was struck by going back to the 80s and 90s, the two main works that Harold Bloom translates and publishes beyond his The Closing of the American Mind, which was a huge bestseller. It made him wealthy. And I've gone back and seen now there's a Saul Bellow novel that fictionalizes Bloom. I mean, he was really, I was growing up with this and in college at the time, but to realize what a major figure he was. And the two main works he translates are Plato's Republic and a work by Rousseau on performance, on theater. He is really interested in the question of whether or not theater can represent. The same question Bruce Dean is asking. Mm-hmm. Is theater a space that is sealed off and hermetically other than the culture? Is it a space where you can go for entertainment? Or does it impact the culture in the same ways that Plato talks about in the Republic through the character of Socrates, right? And here again, Wilson sides on the politics of theater, that theater cannot be removed from politics. Mm-hmm. And that is really what the BIPOC's demand is getting at, that theater must, we can no longer think of it as a kind of separate space. It must respond to the moment, as you know, James Baldwin was doing in '64, when at the time he says in the preface to Blues for Mr. Charlie that he's frustrated with theater in the United States, that it's become a space of commercial speculation, not a place where the culture looks at itself. Mm-hmm. You know, and so what the BIPOC demands is saying, you know, the same way that we've been talking about, is who are writing the plays on Othello's mother, that we can open up an imaginative space to speculate about and think about what it might have been like. You know, there are historical examples that we can go and kind of build upon, but we don't spend time in those spaces because those who are producing theater aren't concerned about those. So to change the moral framework of theater, according to the BIPOC demands, means that your producers have interests that are other than the mainstream interests, that your writers, your actors, that from top to bottom, that theater represents differently. And then maybe helps us imagine the past in different ways, in the same way that that Professor MacDonald has been helping us to do.
There's the play about Othello's mother, of course, is Toni Morrison's Desdemona. But I wonder, as we may be moving toward, you know, a way out of the pandemic and trying to go back to the way things were, the way things they used to be. We've been so changed by these experiences. I don't think that we're going to be doing things, you know, perhaps public things like performance, or the kinds of expectations we have of what we're going to see when we go to the theater will be different. You know, so I wonder how different the performances and the productions that we mount are going to be, how they're going to reflect the fact that we're different people now, that we've been shaped differently, and how are we going to bring that to us when we play. And so I think it's sort of inevitable that things will be different. I just don't know how.
Thank you for that. I think that's a good segue into a second thread that I wanted to pick up on from Roland's answer earlier, and that has to do with the pain and trauma of what we encounter in our research and what we encounter in the archives. And so I'll read a question from Jonathan Chu, which is addressed to everyone on the panel. How do you work through trauma in the archives regarding white supremacy in all its forms? And how do you recommend that Black, Indigenous, and person of color scholars or students prepare for engaging with difficult material in the archive, online, or in performance? Don't all answer at once.
Well, I was just writing something down because I was going to forget it. I was going to, I understand Jonathan's question, but I also feel in a way that it's my duty. It's our duty. If we don't, who will? Who cares as much? Who is as motivated to see that that it's done responsibly and with care? So yeah, it hurts, but it's my duty. Reading as the other part of this paper, these later 18th century sort of neoclassical poems that talk about you basically talk about the rape of slave women, and they're grotesque in the ways that they try to make this seem normal. But if a motivated reader doesn't talk about these poems and talk about the racial matrix in which they're formed, either they're going to be forgotten and we'll forget this happened and we'll be able to walk on our merry way and act like, oh, everything's fine. Or when they get talked about, they'll be talked about in this really distorted way that again leaves the Black women who are their subject and their motivation out of representation. So I'll do it because I think it's necessary. I don't think it should be avoided, and I don't think it should be left to people who don't care.
I'm also struck in this context by Lyra Montero's notion of epistemologies, how we know what we know and what we know. That ways of knowing that many of us might have been taught, we're having to unlearn, because you have to see the archive differently. You have to go into it with your own full embodiment, and a sense that what you see and how you're viewing things is legitimate, it's to be affirmed, and that space has to be made for those new perspectives. We're talking about ways of seeing, really. We're talking about epistemologies and what people with different centers of knowledge bring to a given conversation, whether it be a conversation about the classics, about the medieval period, about the Renaissance. There are things, I'm sure we could each give examples of ways that our curiosities were stifled, or the ways that we were asking questions were repressed. And going back to a certain past, for me, immediate past, is a way of undoing that and trying to see that archive with different eyes.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I agree with the sort of feeling of responsibility as well. I feel like that's one of the places where I operate from, a feeling of responsibility. But I think one of the most, I don't know, the word tragic is really correct to describe it. One of the tragic things that I realized in writing my Byzantine intersectionality book was that at one point somebody was like, well, but you have to be aware that this is a deeply homophobic text as you're trying to recuperate these lives. And I thought, yeah, of course. And I thought, and it was like, oh yeah, but I'm sensitive to this and I recognize this and I'm used to that pain. This pain is not, I've heard the same things said by, bullies on the playground, or even my mother. And it's, for me, accessing these texts, I could in a sense sort of hone in on some of the subjectivities, because at times I didn't see the pain because I was so used to it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also something that's so important. I think it's very different sometimes when, dealing with white supremacist rhetoric online. It's a very different feeling where, you feel the pain and you feel the threat more so than the pain. And I think that's a very different feeling. I think that that's a feeling of fear and concern. And how do I negotiate this as a person who is not just text on a page, but also lives in a certain place and has to worry about their livelihood and safety.
Mhm.
That's another aspect that I think that I'm constantly mediating. But for me in the archives, sometimes I sort of follow the pain because it tells me where the lives are. And it's something that's been, I don't think I've quite acknowledged until this moment right now speaking about this. So thank you all.
Mhm.
Thank you all for that answer. It strikes me, that um, each of your papers is talking in a different way and in different contexts about the claim that we can lay to history, the variety of claims that we can lay to history based on our subject positions. I'm reminded of the argument Orlando Patterson makes in his big book on the vast history of slavery and social death, where he talks about one of the main elements of enslavement being uh, making your enslaved person into a genealogical isolate, where they have no claim on any blood relation, no
Kinley.
claim on no claim on any history,
Mhm.
where they become completely isolated. And of course, American chattel slavery is an absolutely really probably sort of brings this historical element of slavery to its really to the fore. So I'm wondering if uh, if you would be willing to speculate about what a world in the use of Byzantium, what a world in theater, Shakespearean and modern, white and black, what a world where we undo the legacy of genealogical isolation might look like. I'm asking you to get a bit speculative, I suppose.
One of the things that I've thought a lot about are the scenes of the domestic and how they're used to construct racial identity, this sense of kinlessness that you've described as enveloping Black subjects and really sort of impeding the process of Black subjectivity. And so I think that if you don't have any people, if you're just an isolate, you're going to disappear. You will not be here. Nobody will remember your name. One of the things I often fondly imagine, since I am now apparently the matriarch of a large and active family, is what would happen if there were no, sort of couples and little nuclear families with just the two parents and their kids. What if there were larger households? What if there were households that people could come into and leave at any time as these children were taken care of? I think that one of the ways in which reimagining the domestic as a scene of racialization and the enforcement of racial rules is to reorder that nuclear family imperative and give groups of adults um, greater freedom of movement in and out. As long as there's this stable thing, more or less at the center, then if people have more power, more ability to reconfigure their intimate connections, then I think that could be end up being very liberating and remaking thing.
That's interesting, right? Because Patterson's work is about kinship and the loss of kinship. And so this conference becomes a model of a new kind of network and a new kind of kinship, just as in the classics, right?
Yeah.
Yes, in the classics, there's a group, EOS Africana, that is doing similar things and reading texts in conferences, texts that would not have normally been read in those conferences, and creating spaces where people can affiliate. I think that's part of the reimagining.
Mhm.
I also always am very clear to my students when I teach like a methods class that like, you don't just have the day on race or the day on gender, like every day has to be like the narratives are always changed by our work. And I don't think that any colleague of mine who are working on it in a different area would not expect the same of what their research and contribution is. And for me, that's one of the ways of always being enmeshed to say that like our narratives are changing and finding a role within the broader one is something that I'm finding ways to do. I can't rewrite the survey books I use immediately, but I can encourage other tactics and ways of relating between students that can actually help do that. And I'm always reminded of in the musical Assassins, one of the characters says, "Without you, we're just footnotes in a history book." And that line has always rung in my mind as how to work with the footnotes and how to incorporate these concerns and
the things
really
that are off at the side, but that are actually, the essential documentation of what's really going on.
yeah, and that in some ways it is the metadata for everything, all the narratives we know and our understand. And I think that giving those tools really just shatters history. And I think sometimes it's not just about following a subjectivity through a line, but understanding how, of course, the narratives themselves are built through the erasure of these subjectivities. So it is always about these subjects, even if if it is because they have been purged. And that's something that's requires a lot of skill to mediate as well.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for those answers. I think you've left us with some really great ways to go forward, reimagining how our fields should do what they do, and reimagining how, I'd say this branches out to the public sphere and public discourse as well. The reimagining how the world should do what it does, which is, of course, I think one of our most exciting objectives here at Race Before Race generally. So I want to thank all three of our presenters today for leaving us with so much to think about and offering us such rich analysis. And for those of you out there, thank you for being here with us today. I want to remind the audience that tomorrow, for those who are signed up for it, tomorrow at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. Eastern Time, there is a coffee talk on publishing articles on race with David Sterling Brown, fabulous scholar himself, and we can claim him as a Race Before Race Executive Board member. And then at 3 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, our session on race, gender, and the politics of intersectionality with presentations from Yujan Claros, Jennifer L. Morgan, and Stacy Morrow. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming. This was fun. I'm really glad you invited me. Bye-bye.